We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Premier said his government was winning when it comes to finding family doctors for Nova Scotians. Strange news, I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, for thousands of Nova Scotians that have been waiting for a family doctor, especially after being promised one by this government 6 years ago. Stranger still when the Premier's new Deputy Minister of Health said last week that the department is not measuring the difficulty involved in accessing a family doctor as well as it would like. The question for the Premier is, how can the Premier conclude that they are winning at matching orphan patients with family doctors, despite the fact that the department says it's not being measured as much as it should be?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I said, Mr. Speaker, last week was the fact that we were in a global competitive market when it came to accessing primary health care. Teams across, so it's not only Nova Scotia is out there searching for doctors, Mr. Speaker, it's all Canadian provinces and others, George Sixtons. And what I said, Mr. Speaker, we're number 4 in the country with attaching primary care patients to doctors, to healthcare teams, Mr. Speaker. We're number 4 in the country. Only 3 Canadian provinces doing better, Mr. Speaker. We are winning this battle, Mr. Speaker, and we will meet our commitment.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think the 50,000 plus people that are waiting for a family doctor after this government promised them one, I don't think they feel like they're winning, Mr. Speaker. The fact is that this province is losing doctors and specialists faster than it can replace them. We recently learned that the province has attracted 385 new doctors since 2016. But on the other side, they're retiring, they're quitting, they're simply leaving the province, and they're doing such at a rate that's so quick that the demand is not being met. And I'll table a document here where the Deputy Minister says, we're making some inroads, we're making some progress, but clearly not enough. Deputy Minister doesn't think they're winning, says they're not doing enough. I'd like to ask the question, was waiting 2 years to develop a doctor recruitment strategy, was that part of the Premier's winning strategy?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, within the last 12 months, the Honourable Member stood in his place and said there were 100,000 Nova Scotians without a doctor. Today he confirmed, Mr. Speaker, there's around 50,000. Mr. Speaker, I would say we're winning.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier's idea of winning is much different. Much different than what Nova Scotians' idea of winning is. Winning is clear and defined, like the last 4 by-elections. Winning is not some subjective idea. The fact of the matter is 52,000 Nova Scotians that we know of still can't find a family doctor. 52,000. The Deputy Minister said at Public Accounts last year that only half the people report on the line. 52,000 plus 52,000 is over 100,000, Mr. Speaker. We are not winning as a province when it comes to recruiting family doctors. And I'd like to ask the Premier, what part of the Premier's winning playbook entailed the loss of dozens of specialists and family doctors from Nova Scotia's communities all across this province?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, because the Honourable Member makes up a number, Mr. Speaker, doesn't make it true. The fact of the matter is he stood in this place twice, Mr. Speaker, in the last year. At one point he said it was 100,000. Now he stands up saying it's 52,000. Mr. Speaker, that is a substantial gain in ensuring that people have access to primary health care. I want to tell the Honourable Member, Mr. Speaker, we know there's more work to do. It's why the Minister of Immigration now has sent a second team into the UK, Mr. Speaker, with a new stream, quite frankly, that is unique to Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, that gives us the competitive edge in this global environment where we're out competing for healthcare workers, Mr. Speaker. He might be pessimistic about the future of this province, Mr. Speaker. This side is optimistic, and we're working with our teams to make it happen.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the Canadian Rental Housing Index, the most...
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the Canadian Rental Housing Index, the province of Atlantic Canada that has the most unhealthy rental housing market isn't New Brunswick or PEI or Newfoundland. It's us here in Nova Scotia. And speaking for our part in the NDP, we didn't need the index to tell us this, because we are hearing regularly from people who are being served with rental increases of 30, 40, 50, even 55%. So I want to ask the Premier if he also recognizes that the rental housing situation in Nova Scotia is at a real breaking point for an awful lot of people.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. He is highlighting a major issue, Mr. Speaker, that we know as in parts of our province. We continue to work with rent subs to ensuring that we're providing affordable housing. One of the things that happens, Mr. Speaker, when we see the tremendous growth that is happening in parts of our province, you begin to see the price of real estate continue to escalate, continue to go up, the market demands on that, so it pushes out, Mr. Speaker, some affordable rents that I know that the leader is very concerned about. It's why we've worked to try to make sure that we put rent subs in place to ensure those families who require that support have them. He would also know that we just signed a national housing agreement with the federal government, and we will continue to work with our partners in the community to make sure that we're providing affordable housing in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier speaks as he has often spoken in the past when we have questioned and challenged him and his government about this question about rent supplements and the place they have in the government's program for dealing with this situation. But it's increasingly common to hear from people who have in fact been assigned rent supplements who still, nevertheless, are not able to find an affordable, adequate place for themselves to live. Now, surely the Premier can see that in such a tight rental market as we have, it's a pretty easy thing for landlords to choose someone who doesn't have a rent supplement over somebody who does. So I want to ask the Premier if he is confident that everybody with a government rent supplement is actually able to find a place for themselves to live.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the information I have, Mr. Speaker, is those rent subs are making a positive impact on those who have them. I will undertake from the question of the Honourable Member whether or not that rent sub is adequate today or whether or not that should be adjusted. I think that's a legitimate question as we look into what we do with the new housing strategy going forward. So if that is not meeting the pressure of the current market that the Honourable Member is referring to, we certainly will look at that.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the government surely must be as aware as we are aware of how common it is becoming for landlords in the province to undertake renovations as a pretext to evict tenants with the real purpose of making dramatic increases in the rent. When the government first came to office, the word renoviction was not a part of the vocabulary of the housing world in Nova Scotia, but it most certainly is a part of the vocabulary of our housing situation today in the province. So in response to our questions about the housing crisis, Mr. Speaker, we've heard members of the government speak several times about the bilateral housing agreement and what it stands to bring for the future. But can the Premier tell us what his government is going to do to protect tenants from these kinds of renovictions now?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Renoviction wasn't part of the vocabulary of the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, before we come in, because our economy wasn't growing, Mr. Speaker. We weren't seeing the fast growth that we're seeing with not only population, more young people coming back. We know that it's putting pressure, though, on the housing stock to ensure that we have affordable rents in some parts of our province, Mr. Speaker. It's why I have made a commitment to the Honourable Member that we will look at whether or not those rent subs are meeting the needs of today when they come in. But the fact of the matter is that the growth that we're seeing is putting pressure on some of these properties. There's absolutely no question about that. A growing economy, providing more opportunities, more jobs, unemployment is all-time low, Mr. Speaker. We're attracting people back home. That is definitely impacting the affordable housing market, and it's why, with that $400 million from the national government and the rent subs we put in place, we'll continue to work with our partners to ensure that we address the very need that the Honourable Member is bringing up.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When Yarmouth's community medical recruiter retired 5 years ago and wasn't replaced by the Nova Scotia Health Authority, patients were put at a disadvantage, particularly cancer patients. But the community pulled together, and over the summer, plans were announced by the Chamber of Commerce to hire a community navigator to facilitate physician recruitment. And a few weeks ago, a community navigator was hired to go to work on recruiting and retaining doctors in Yarmouth. I'd like to ask the Premier, has the government considered funding such positions for other communities across the province, and how many have they funded so far?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance announced in the budget there's $200,000 we set aside to partner with community organizations who are out doing work. Lunenburg Now was leading the way as an organization. They were a tremendous group. The group in Yarmouth has taken it on. I know there's a group in the Valley who are responding to come to look for support. There are other parts of the province, but Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to work. I shouldn't forget the group in Amherst, who was doing a tremendous job. I'm trying to forget the name of the doctor, Mr. Speaker, right off the top of my head. I can't think of it. But I will tell you, they are leading the way in communities, and we wanted to support them to continue to help collaborate with government as we go forward. I know there's a doctor on a recruiting trip right now who's working with us. All of that would be able to be supported. There is no one specific way where we're going to be able to continue to bring that number down, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to look for all kinds of avenues.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would add Pictou County, and I would add some Cape Breton communities, because communities all across this province are stepping up because they realize we're not winning on doctor recruitment. And in days gone by, communities had a say in recruiting and retaining physicians in their own community. But the creation of the Nova Scotia Health Authority took that away. And we now know it was taken away, and for 2 years, nobody even thought about it until suddenly somebody said, maybe we should focus on recruitment and retention at the Nova Scotia Health Authority. I'd like to ask the Premier if the fact that the government is now setting money aside to help communities find their own doctors, if that is an acknowledgement of the strategy of recruitment that they've had in this province, where they've consolidated it all in an office in Halifax, has been a total failure.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, Mr. Speaker, let me correct the honourable member. The fact of the matter is, recruitment in the first 2 years was done at the Department of Health, Mr. Speaker. It was transitioned in year 2 of the Health Authority into the responsibility of the Health Authority. There are currently 11 people working on the recruitment side within the Health Authority. But what we've heard, Mr. Speaker, is from communities who wanted to be part of the solution, Mr. Speaker, instead of always being negative about the challenges they face. They brought forward positive solutions. We went to work with them, Mr. Speaker, and contrary to what the Leader of the Conservative Party says, they're grateful, quite frankly, that the government is listening and well to work with them, Mr. Speaker. They're well aware of the opportunities that exist in their community. They're better than anyone, Mr. Speaker, to be able to tell the virtues of that particular community. And we're grateful, Mr. Speaker, that they continue to work with their government on a positive view and a positive vision for this province. It's why we're seeing more doctors choose to come here, Mr. Speaker. It's why we're number 4 in Canada of attaching our patients directly to primary care groups. And, Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to make sure we do that.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. University of Calgary economist Trevor Tombe has said there doesn't appear to be any strong evidence for sports teams moving in or out of a city having any meaningful impact on income, employment, or jobs overall. And I can table that. Yesterday, the Premier said that he will be looking into the entire economic footprint of the plan for a stadium in Shannon Park. But the bottom line is that government funding for private stadiums only serve to line the pockets of for-profit companies and stick the public with the bill. Can the Premier please explain who in this government will be responsible for undertaking the economic analysis of the stadium proposal, and when the results will be made available to the public?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member would have said yesterday, that is before City Council. City Council is going to have to make a decision, Mr. Speaker. I have not looked at the proposal come forward. As I told her, we would have a look at that. Any decision that we make, Mr. Speaker, we have to defend. We will do that, but we will communicate back to the people. But what I did say, there would be no general revenue coming from the province of Nova Scotia going into that stadium.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier said that his government is willing to commit up to $120 million of public money towards a stadium, maybe not from general revenue streams, but finding new streams of money, which could be spent on other things like affordable housing, based on the study of the economic benefits. Meanwhile, we already possess the analysis from Gardner Pinfold that investments in ambitious renewable energy and energy-efficient targets will create thousands of jobs and help avert the worst of the climate crisis. So can the Premier please explain what it will take for his government to commit to investing in these green jobs that we know will have a positive impact?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I said no such thing. We were investing in the stadium, Mr. Speaker. I very clearly said the exact opposite, Mr. Speaker. What I said, we would look at a proposal. at no point, check answered, that I said we were going to invest in the stadium. To the second part of our question, Mr. Speaker, we continue to invest, ensuring that we increase the carbon footprint of individuals. Efficiency Nova Scotia has been helping more Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, reduce their carbon footprint, to green up their properties, Mr. Speaker. We've seen continued number of investments made in green energy. The Minister of Energy has made an announcement on harnessing the tides in the Bay of Fundy. We're going to continue to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that we reduce our greenhouse gas. We do not only, Mr. Speaker, what is expected of us when it comes to ensuring we improve the environment, we'll do more, Mr. Speaker, which Nova Scotians have been doing for the last couple of decades. But at the same time, I want to tell the honourable member, we have a responsibility to grow the economy of this province. We'll do it with green jobs, Mr. Speaker. We'll do it by encouraging the private sector to continue to grow, to provide economic opportunities. That's why more young people are staying here, Mr. Speaker. And quite frankly, that is why, Mr. Speaker, unemployment rate is going down.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you. My question is for the Minister of Health. Since 2012, the Department of Health and Wellness has maintained a physician resource planning update. This planning exercise forecasts the clinical workforce required over a 10-year period. The department has described it as a tool to inform planning and training around doctors. However, since 2016, no further updates or forecasts have been made public. Doctors Nova Scotia has said this puts students and residents who want to practice here at an information disadvantage, and I will table that document. My question is, why is the department conducting internal resource forecasts but is no longer making them public?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. That's not what's taking place with the Physician Resource Plan, Mr. Speaker. The Physician Resource Plan was built off a proprietary modeling system. Mr. Speaker, as has been cited in this legislature and in past sessions several times, that report identified, I believe, an average of 1,000 physicians over a 10-year period, which worked out to a target of about 100 physicians per year. Mr. Speaker, I think we've clearly noted that we are working to recruit more than 100 physicians per year. And so when the work that was being done under the model came back with essentially the same information, we recognized that model wasn't working for Nova Scotia, and we had to take a different approach.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Yes, and last year when I asked the question, the different approach was an app. We all know that in the past, the Minister's defence of shelving these resource forecasts has been simple. Oh, we have an app for that. He was previously stated, and I have tabled that document already, that he was quoted, in-house analytical tool would help the department and the NSHA track future needs. And he sounded like he was in no rush to make that tool public. So keeping this taxpayer-funded data information from the public may actually, Mr. Speaker, save the government from answering tough questions, but it certainly won't let Nova Scotians believe they have the confidence that this government is on top of this issue. So I'd like to know, when will the in-house analytical tool that the minister indicated, when will that be ready to make public for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We continue to work with frontline healthcare professionals and our partners at the health authorities, both the Nova Scotia Health Authority and the IWK, to identify the healthcare needs and the healthcare professionals that are necessary for delivering care that Nova Scotians need and deserve. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the member's concern that she's raised here about releasing information publicly, but Mr. Speaker, it does nobody any service if we release information before it's ready to do so. Information has to be accurate. We have to have confidence in the information that's brought forward to us as a department to help inform our decisions and the processes that we move forward with. So, Mr. Speaker, that's the work that's ongoing, and when it's ready and complete, Mr. Speaker, we're able to bring that forward through the more public forums.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've raised this issue a few times in this session, but the numbers on the NSHA's Need a Family Practice Registry leave us very concerned. About a year ago, the minister stood across from us and proudly stated the declining numbers of doctors, numbers of Nova Scotians that had registered for a doctor. But the numbers on the registry have gone nowhere this year, floating around above 52,000 or more. So they've actually gone up, Mr. Speaker, and I can table that document. This stands in contrast to the department's deputy minister recently stating that we're making some progress. We're in a positive balance. So how does the minister account for the fact that the number of Nova Scotians self-identifying as needing a family doctor has remained quite stagnant?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for the question. Obviously, as we've discussed many times on this floor, attaching Nova Scotians to primary care providers is of an utmost priority for this government and indeed for all Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I'd have to take a look at the document the member tabled, but the fact of the matter is, if you track the Need a Family Practice update, which does provide the details of data, I believe the list peaked out in November of 2018 at about 59,000 people. As of today, the data that was released, I believe went online earlier today, is 51,000 Nova Scotians waiting. That's a decrease of about 13.5%, Mr. Speaker, year over year. That's progress, Mr. Speaker, based upon the many activities that we've been taking to improve recruitment and attachment of Nova Scotians to primary care providers.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, we've heard from many Nova Scotians lately with concerns about the operation of the Need a Family Practice list. It appears that in some cases, folks have been removed from the list as the result of an error, and they are uncertain of their priority on that list. They don't know if they are put at the bottom of the list or if they are restored to the previous place on the list. Clearly, this would be of great concern to anyone who has waited years for a phone call matching them with a family doctor. So my question to the minister is, if Nova Scotians who have not found a doctor are removed from the list as a result of NSHA, is it policy that they regain their spot in line or they put back to the bottom of the list?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Again, the introduction of the Need a Family Practice list in 2016 provided an opportunity for the Health Authority and the Department to better understand the needs, not just the needs in a general sense in terms of a number for across the province, but indeed regionally to understand where needs may be more acute. Mr. Speaker, that's how the list is helping inform. It's also, Mr. Speaker, helping with primary care providers, collaborative practices, and family physicians in their own independent practices to facilitate them when they're looking to expand their practice or set up a new practice. That's what we use the list for, Mr. Speaker. We provide that information. They contact the individuals as primary providers, contact the individuals on the list, and they attach them that way, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're using the list for, and that's how it processes.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this government has lost 10 doctors over the past year in the Minister of Health's own constituency. Now, the last time I asked the minister about that here in this House, he basically said to me that he wasn't going to give his home area special treatment. Well, Mr. Speaker, if that's the way Antigonish is going to be treated, God help the rest of the province. What happened since? They lost another physician. Number 11, an obstetric specialist. Now there are none. That affects people over an hour away in the constituency of Inverness. If you live there and you are having a baby, you have a problem. This government has created conditions at your regional hospital where doctors are bailing. Why has the minister let conditions in healthcare get to the point where doctors are leaving his own constituency in droves?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find it interesting that the member would continue to suggest that as a minister I should somehow treat my constituency differently than any other. Obviously, we understand where the individual may choose to govern, but Mr. Speaker, when I took the oath as the Minister of Health and Wellness, it was to serve the entire province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, as the member cited information related to physicians who may have retired or chosen to pursue a practice elsewhere, what he conveniently fails to indicate, Mr. Speaker, are the number of physicians that have come and started working in Antigonish at St. Martha's Regional Hospital, Mr. Speaker. We've had several come and join, including an obstetrician, Mr. Speaker, to replace the one who left.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is there are no obstetricians in Antigonish today. I checked today. There are none. And, Mr. Speaker, the minister can say that it's me suggesting that he treat his area with special interest, but if you go back into Hansard, those were his words, not mine. The only thing I'm asking is that he look after people in his own area and the rest of the province. But if he can't look after his own area, how can he look after the rest of the province? Mr. Speaker, people going to St. Martha's Hospital have only have access to visiting obstetricians. But the consequences go beyond that. When there's only one, or zero, in this case, specialists at a hospital, it can deter the recruitment of other specialists because all of the work and crisis situations are going to fall on their shoulders. Who wants to come into a hospital managed by this government with those work conditions when there are other jurisdictions looking to give these doctors better quality of life and pay? My question, what good is the minister's recruitment strategy when he has failed to change the conditions he has created in hospitals that have led so many doctors to want to leave?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for his inquiries. I think the member, if he was so inclined, I know that St. Martha's Regional Hospital serves his own constituents, but I don't recall seeing the member there when we had a rally of support, a show of support for the healthcare providers at St. Martha's Regional Hospital that was organized. But, Mr. Speaker, I was there talking to the many people in and around Antigonish, Richmond, Mr. Speaker, Guysborough and Inverness, the member's constituency. And
Order,
Mr. Speaker,
please. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health has the floor.
And Mr. Speaker,
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health has the floor.
And Mr. Speaker, the member likes to highlight and stress the health care that's being provided in Antigonish. If the member looks at the previous questions of his colleague focused on primary care access, Mr. Speaker, Antigonish and the region has actually the best attachment, Mr. Speaker, in the province for primary care services throughout Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That's because of the many dedicated professionals in the health care system providing that care, Mr. Speaker. We have a very strong, robust health care system, Mr. Speaker. In St. Martha's Regional Hospital is a fantastic hospital where professionals provide that care to members in the region.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. Yesterday, when I asked the Minister of Housing about regulations for short-term rentals, he responded that Nova Scotia has finally signed a bilateral housing agreement which will unfold over the next decade. But that does not address the impact that short-term rentals are having on the housing market today. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister please tell Nova Scotians when they can expect regulations to control the impact of short-term rentals on the housing market?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. The actual regulations around the Airbnb, the short-term rental legislation, will be in place by this tourism season upcoming. So that's of 2020. So obviously there is an impetus and a requirement for us to have those in place. Working with my colleague at Municipal Affairs, the Minister has been great in consulting municipalities, stakeholders around where we're going to go with those regulations and exactly what the stakeholders need at tie-ins in the municipalities and all of those that will be impacted. Again, Mr. Speaker, as I said around this question, part of the key for this regulatory piece and the registration system that we'll have for short-term rentals is that we have the exact data, the information, the understanding of how this will impact the housing stock, whether that be for short-term rentals, whether that be for affordable housing and the housing stock that's available in Metro, in Cape Breton, and all regions of the province. So that data is important, Mr. Speaker, and it will be ready and up and running by this spring.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, if the Minister would like to personally visit some data points, I could walk him around my neighbourhood. I would like to ask how the bilateral agreement is addressing this issue, and this question is for the Minister of Housing. No doubt it is good news that the province has signed a bilateral agreement, and the first 3-year action plan. However, in the consultation with municipalities, they identified that Airbnb and the sharing economy are common barriers to affordable housing, and the action plan does not address this barrier. Will the Minister of Housing acknowledge that one of the key reasons Nova Scotians are struggling to find a place to live is because long-term rental stock is disappearing into the short-term market?
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. The honourable member mentioned the 3-year action plan, which we did just sign a short time ago. We will be investing in that $88 million, which will help thousands of households, Mr. Speaker, in this province. The province of Nova Scotia is investing another $70 million, Mr. Speaker, as well, unmatched dollars, which will invest in even about 2,500 more households right across this province and make a number of priorities for affordable housing to better serve Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, right across this province. We recognize the issue. The Premier alluded to a few minutes ago. We'll continue to work on it. There's lots of work to do. We're anxious to get started.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Les Goulden is the chair of the Physician Recruitment and Retention Committee at Roseway Hospital, and he tells us that the physician situation at Roseway is hitting a critical point. Dr. John Keeler, who has been in rotation at the hospital for 35 years, is about to retire. Dr. Ryan Posse is buying out his contract and is expected to return to New Brunswick by December 1st of this year. And another physician, Dr. Leanne DeLong, is on maternity leave. So that leaves one physician, Dr. Trudy McFarlane, to handle all inpatient care. My question to the minister is, since the NSHA knows about the near-crisis staffing situation at Roseway, what do they plan to do about it?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member for raising this issue on behalf of her constituents. Obviously, a concerning situation there, Mr. Speaker. I'm one that I checked in on with the health authority. It's my understanding they've been having meetings, including meetings as recently as the last day or two. So those engagements with community and healthcare providers to provide input and suggestions and chart that path forward are ongoing, Mr. Speaker. So again, it is a situation the Health Authority and the Department are well aware of, and one that is actively being worked on.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that the minister is being sincere when he reports that there's programs and incentives and meetings are taking place to help ease the healthcare anxieties of Nova Scotians. But those same anxious constituents of mine are not comforted by steps that may take many years to deliver results on the ground. And I truly believe that the minister needs to go to the ground level to grasp the acute and immediate problems that are facing inpatient care delivery for my constituents in Shelburne. My question is, will the minister commit to sitting down with doctors and the Physician Recruitment and Retention Committee in order to help alleviate pressures on inpatient care at the Roseway?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been to Roseway Hospital. I've met with a physician there, along with other representatives in the facility. Mr. Speaker, I believe the Deputy Minister, including the interim Deputy Minister, was recently down there as well. Staff, we continue to maintain dialogue and information engagement. Again, the Health Authority, in their role and responsibility around recruitment, is actively involved and engaged in the Shelburne area with Roseway, as they are in other communities right across this province, Mr. Speaker. We understand the challenge that we have. That's why we're taking steps to improve the situation, both short-term initiatives, Mr. Speaker, like locum incentives to address the hard-to-fill positions, but also the long-term strategies the member opposite referenced.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, in September I hosted a town hall on healthcare in Kentville. Participants at that event were most concerned about the wait times in the ER. And ER doctors in attendance suggested it was because of the huge increase in the number of orphan patients stemming from a shortage of family doctors. A quick check of the physician recruitment report shows the Western region is looking for 33 family doctors. My question for the minister is, how does the minister expect to fix emergency room backlogs when there are not enough family practitioners to keep primary issues out of the ER?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for acknowledging the importance of a focus on primary care services as an important part of the strategy to help address pressures at our emergency departments. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I've spoken to that point in the past. It's why we've focused on initiatives, Mr. Speaker, to improve access to primary care services, investments and expansion of collaborative care practices, Mr. Speaker, expansion of training opportunities at Dalhousie Medical School and the residency program, the only jurisdiction in the country, Mr. Speaker, making that investment in our medical students and our future medical professionals, Mr. Speaker. These are steps that we're taking to improve the situation, not just for the members' community, but in communities right across this province.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the minister for that answer. There was a clinic in New Minas and it's been closed now, and I can tell you many of my constituents are very upset at the loss of that clinic. Yesterday, the Nova Scotia Health Authority was advertising for 2 new family physicians in Kentville, 1 in New Minas, 1 in Canning. The NSHA's own statistics as of September 1st suggest 10.6% of residents in the Western region are without a family physician. My question for the minister is, when will the minister accept that health care in the Western region is in crisis?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Indeed, efforts continue and the work is ongoing with recruitment strategies and initiatives, Mr. Speaker. The steps that we take, there is no one path to the end state, Mr. Speaker. We have to address both short-term, medium-term, and long-term situations. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we invest in short-term incentives and programs, Mr. Speaker, including the approximately $40 million investment, Mr. Speaker, in primary care compensation and incentives, Mr. Speaker, to help attach Nova Scotians to primary care providers, providing comprehensive primary care. But again, we can't ignore the long-term initiatives that were underway too, Mr. Speaker, like those I mentioned in my previous response.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last summer, I was approached by a constituent who was disappointed to tell me that a local Cumberland County woman who had studied medicine and had just finished a 2-year family medicine residency outside of the province had decided to set up a family practice on the West Coast. She went on to tell me that no one from the health authority had contacted her to let her know about any opportunities here in the province. No one made any attempt to recruit her back to our province. I was surprised to hear this. So my question to the Minister of Health is, has he considered creating a physician recruitment plan for Nova Scotia that includes identifying Nova Scotians who have studied abroad or maybe completed their residencies in other provinces, identified them, target them as part of the recruitment plan? For we know most Nova Scotia physicians do want to come back home, and I think it's important that we make sure they know about the opportunities and recruit and retain them back to Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question, suggestion to help pursue. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, we look at numerous avenues and opportunities to connect with prospective recruits. One of the challenges with the model or the approach that the member has suggested is indeed being able to identify these individuals who may have studied outside of the province. The health system has no means of knowing when a student who may have done their undergraduate or medical studies in other jurisdictions to identify. So certainly if the member has a suggestion in terms of how to solicit that information, indeed I certainly put the call out to all of my colleagues. If you're aware of people that are from your communities, Mr. Speaker, certainly feel free to pass that information on to your local recruiters or my office as well.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this was somebody that had actually studied medicine here at Dalhousie, but did their family medicine residency outside of the province. So we would have access to all the Dalhousie medical graduates that our recruitment officers could be using. I also wanted to bring attention to Dr. Brian Ferguson, recently retired from his practice of 38 years in Cumberland and Amherst. The community and I are so grateful for his service, but I wanted to identify the fact that after 38 years, no one from the Health Authority or the NSHA had contacted him to do an exit interview, to say thank you, or to ask how many of his patients would actually be left without a family doctor. My question to the Minister of Health is, for the purpose of physician recruitment, does he not think that the NSHA should be asking retiring doctors how many patients they have, what are their demographics, and what are their patient needs?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Indeed, the expectation is that the Health Authority, when they're able, that is, when they're aware of physicians retiring or closing up their practice, conduct exit interviews. Mr. Speaker, the member brings forward an example of a particular physician where that apparently didn't take place. Mr. Speaker, I'll be following up with the Health Authority to confirm that situation. And again, if members opposite are aware of situations in their communities where an offer of an exit interview, because it is important to note, Mr. Speaker, that although the Health Authority can put out the offer of an exit interview, there is no means or mechanism to force the physician, retiring physician, or healthcare provider to participate.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the New Waterford Hospital is closing at the end of this week for renovations on the main floor, and staff from the hospital are being sent to Glace Bay. Local residents are worried that this might be the final time the hospital closes its doors. Doctors at the Glace Bay Hospital are paid a premium over those who serve in New Waterford, and I can't imagine that they'll want to come back to New Waterford making $50 less an hour. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Health tell me and my constituents, is this Friday the last day that the New Waterford Hospital will be open to serve patients?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Again, the member would know that we're investing heavily in the New Waterford area in the future of the infrastructure for their healthcare services, Mr. Speaker. We remain committed to ensuring that we provide healthcare services in that community. As for the current facility that's in New Waterford, Mr. Speaker, we've made it clear there's no plans to cease services being provided at that facility, Mr. Speaker, till after we have a new centre available for that community to receive care.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, many renovations, major renovations and upgrades to the physical building at the New Waterford Hospital have been going on for 2 years now, even though the Liberals announced that the hospital would be closing more than a year ago. Mr. Speaker, rumours are going around in the community that the government plans to sell the hospitals that miners paid for to a private nursing home to operate for $1. Mr. Speaker, can the minister confirm that upgrades to the New Waterford Hospital are being undertaken to get the property ready to be transformed into a private nursing home?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I can assure the member opposite is that investments in upgrades or maintenance, Mr. Speaker, in the Waterford facility, much like other facilities across the province, are being done because they're necessary to be done, Mr. Speaker, to provide a safe environment for patients and the healthcare providers working within them. There are no plans, Mr. Speaker, decisions made as to what steps would be taken with these facilities. Our focus, Mr. Speaker, is on getting the new facility built for that community, Mr. Speaker, to provide healthcare infrastructure for the next 50 years in that community.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. Crown attorneys in this province have full plates. Unfortunately, at times, these full plates leave them with less time than they'd like to have in order to meet with survivors. This has become a problem in cases of human trafficking where survivors have been brainwashed, tortured, and manipulated to a point where they require patience and compassion. For an overworked Crown attorney, even the most empathetic person simply does not have the capacity to provide these victims with the time they deserve and need. My question is, what resources are made available to Crown attorneys to ensure human trafficking victims receive the attention and care they require?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. Human trafficking is a serious concern in the province. I've had the recent opportunity to meet with the member as well as advocates of survivors of human trafficking. We have recently expanded the police unit here in the province, Mr. Speaker, around education and awareness of the issue. We're engaging our public prosecution as we speak, Mr. Speaker, on opportunities within the guns and gangs funding that we've committed to this issue, $4.7 million. We recognize human trafficking as an organized crime matter, and as I've said to my colleague in past discussions, this is a non-political, all-party discussion, and we have to find a solution.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, and thank you for that answer. I totally agree. It's a nonpartisan issue. The way our system is structured, however, the only way for a human trafficking case to be tried is for the victim to take the stand, look at their attacker right in the face, and testify. These traffickers, pimps, johns have often physically and mentally abused their victims. And these victims have to face their pimps, johns, who have tortured them, blackmailed them, brainwashed them, and threatened their family. You name it. They've done everything to them. But due to staffing shortages at victim services, victims often have to take the stand with no support worker by their side. So they stand there all on their own. What steps has the minister taken to guarantee that every victim of human trafficking has a victim services worker with them throughout their whole trial?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my colleague raises a most important element in the criminal justice process, particularly in the area of preparation for court and trial. Vulnerable witnesses who have faced the very circumstances that my colleague has identified need that support. The Victim Services Program is established throughout the province. If there are circumstances that my colleague is aware of where victim services aren't providing support, I'm certainly interested in hearing those concerns, because it is our objective in creating the human trafficking section and expanding that unit. Part of their mandate is to support survivors. It's important that every element of the criminal justice system is there to support survivors, and we'll work towards that objective.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
My question is for the Minister of Education. In our education system, we teach students about puberty starting in grade 4, and we start sex education in grade 5. We teach about safe sex and issues to watch out for, but we don't teach about the dangers of sexual exploitation and what manipulation from someone who claims to love you looks like. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia sits at the top of the list of the number of reported human trafficking incidences, yet we don't teach about human trafficking in our public school system. My question for the Minister of Education is this: what work has been done to include human trafficking in our provincial curriculum? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. A very serious question, and members of our caucus have brought concerns related to this to our attention as well. We can look into options in our curriculum process. Of course, that process is driven by our teachers. We allow them to take the lead when it comes to curriculum enhancement and developments, and we can ensure that the conversation that the member opposite is advancing here can be advanced through that process as well.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The RCMP has reported children as young as 12 years old are working in the sex trade industry in Halifax. We've heard from parents with children who were manipulated and taken out of the province at 14 years old to work in the sex trade. This isn't a problem in some faraway land. This isn't a problem of the past or the future. This is a problem that is happening right here and now in Nova Scotia. It's very real, and it's very terrifying. Mr. Speaker, given that our children have a right to be equipped with the education to properly protect themselves from those working to manipulate and exploit them, will the minister work with the advocates to create human trafficking curriculum? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Work is ongoing with the RCMP as well. They have a human trafficking unit that goes into communities, helps inform communities about the risks associated with this and what to look for. And we can, of course, always look at enhancing those partnerships to improve the education that we're giving our students, particularly on something as scary, as consequential, and problematic as this particular issue.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. I'm a registered nurse myself with experience in working in acute inpatient psychiatry nursing and addiction services. I've had first-hand experience working with youth in need of acute psychiatric services, but my professional training only enables me to go so far. Since there's no access to inpatient mental health beds for children and adolescents in Cape Breton, parents and local health professionals are left trying to help the youth of my community without all the necessary resources. Additionally, acute cases need to be brought to the IWK without the certainty of being admitted, so potentially being sent back to Cape Breton. The costs are no longer just health-related, but are also financial, psychological, since parents are forced to cover gas, hotels, meals, and much more. My question is, can the Minister let the people of Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg know when they'll have a child and adolescent psychiatrist in their community? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for raising this very important question, important for his constituents. Mr. Speaker, especially those in need of these services. Certainly, psychiatric and mental health services in the Cape Breton region, Mr. Speaker, have been a priority for me since coming into this office. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Health and Wellness, we had a number of recommendations provided by now Senator Dr. Stan Kuchar, based upon a review of services already available in that community. And we continue to invest, Mr. Speaker, in programs and services to help.
Thank you very much. Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.